For decades, the city of Manchester was famous for two things: world-class football and a music scene that defined a generation. But while the rest of the world was looking at the trophies and the nightclubs, the locals in Moss Side saw something else. They saw lines drawn in the concrete. They saw young men dying over postcodes. They saw a city earning a new, darker name, Gunchester. This is not a story about glory. It is a story about a war that turned residential streets into free fire zones. It is the story of the Gooch Gang and the Doddington Gang, two sides of the same bloody coin. At the center of this chaos were men like Colin, Joyce and Amos, gangsters who believed they were celebrities, untouchable warlords who could execute rivals in broad daylight and laugh about it. In court, they thought they owned the city. They thought fear was a currency that would never devalue. But they made a mistake. A mistake born of pure, unadulterated arrogance. They forgot that when you push a community into hell, eventually, the devils you created come back to testify. This is the story of the Manchester Turf War. This is how the streets were soaked in blood, and how the kings of the underground finally lost their crowns. To understand the bloodshed, you have to understand the geography. We are talking about South Manchester, Moss Side. In the 1980s and 90s, this area was neglected, struggling with unemployment and marginalized by the state. In that vacuum, the drug trade flourished. Originally, there was not a war. There were just criminals making money. But money brings greed, and greed brings division. The split happened almost organically, defined by territory. On one side, you had the Gooch Gang, named after a small street in the estate. On the other, the Doddington Gang. They had once been friends. They grew up together, played football together, went to the same schools. But when the powder keg of the drug trade ignited, those childhood bonds evaporated. What replaced them was a hatred so visceral, so intense, that it defied logic. It was not just about business anymore, it was about respect. It was about vengeance. By the early 2000s, the conflict had escalated into a tit-for-tat cycle of executions. If a Gooch member was stabbed, a Doddington member had to be shot. If a Doddington car was torched, a Gooch house had to be firebombed. The police struggled to keep up. The no-snitching culture was absolute. Witnesses were terrified. To talk to the police in Moss Side was not just frowned upon, it was a death sentence. Rising through the ranks of the Gooch Gang during this period of absolute chaos was a man named Colin Joyce. Joyce was not your typical thug. He was calculated, he was intelligent, and he was utterly, terrifyingly psychopathic. He did not just kill for business. He seemed to derive a sick satisfaction from the power over life and death. He was the chaotic force, the general on the streets. Beside him was Amos, known as Cabo. Amos was the strategist, the weapons master, the man who ensured the gang had the firepower to wage a literal war. Together, Joyce and Amos transformed the Gooch Gang from a group of street dealers into a paramilitary organization. They armored their cars. They sourced automatic weaponry. They ran the estate like a dictatorship. They taxed other dealers. They controlled the supply lines, and they eliminated anyone who looked at them the wrong way. But their brutality would become their undoing. The turning point, the moment the war went from a local issue to a national crisis, came with the murder of UCAL Chin and Tyrone Gilbert. UCAL Chin was 24. He was driving his car in June 2007 when he was ambushed. A car pulled up alongside him and bullets tore through the metal. He was hit, he died. The police suspected the Gooch Gang, specifically Joyce and Amos, but as always the wall of silence held firm. No witnesses, no convictions. The gang felt invincible. They had just executed a rival or someone they perceived as a rival and walked away scot-free. This success fed their ego. It fed the beast. 6 weeks later, UCAL Chin was being buried. His funeral was a massive event in the community. Hundreds of mourners gathered to pay their respects. In any civilized society, a funeral is sacred ground. Even in the underworld, there are usually rules. You do not hit the family. You do not hit the church. Colin Joyce and Amos did not care about rules. To them, the funeral was not a tragedy. It was a target-rich environment. It was July 27, 2007. The wake for UCAL Chin was being held. The streets were lined with grieving friends and family. Suddenly, a dark Audi S4 and a Honda Legend roared onto the scene. They did not just drive by. They slowed down. Windows rolled down. And then, the sound of automatic gunfire shattered the morning. They sprayed the crowd. Bullets flew indiscriminately into the mass of people. It was an act of domestic terrorism. In the chaos, Tyrone Gilbert, a 23-year-old father of 3, was hit in the chest. He died where he fell. This was the mistake. This was not a targeted hit in a dark alley. This was a massacre at a funeral. The sheer brazenness of the attack shocked the nation. It crossed a line that even the hardened residents of Moss Side could not ignore. It was not just gang on gang anymore, it was an attack on the community's soul. Joyce and Amos thought this display of power would cement their rule. They thought it would terrify the community into even deeper silence. They were wrong. It did the opposite. It brought the full, unmitigated weight of the Greater Manchester Police down on their heads. The police launched Operation Damascus. It was one of the largest and most complex investigations in UK history. They knew they could not just arrest the foot soldiers. They needed the generals. They needed Joyce and Amos. But physical evidence was scarce. The gunmen had worn balaclavas. The cars were burned out or scrubbed clean. The guns were disposed of. To convict them, the police needed the one thing the gangs had successfully suppressed for decades: voices. They needed insiders. The cracks in the Gooch Gang began to show. Joyce's leadership style, ruling by fear, had created enemies within his own ranks. His arrogance was so profound that he treated his own soldiers as disposable pawns. The police managed to flip 2 former gang members. These were not low-level dealers. These were men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Joyce and Amos. They had seen the orders given. They had seen the guns. These witnesses were placed in absolute secrecy. New identities, new lives, complete protection. Their testimony would be the dagger in the heart of the Gooch Gang. But Joyce and Amos were still confident. Even as they were arrested and charged, they treated the legal process like a joke. They believed the stop snitching code was unbreakable. They believed that no jury would dare convict them. The trial was a spectacle. The court had to be fortified like a military bunker. Armed police patrolled the perimeter. The witnesses gave evidence from behind screens. Their voices modulated, their names hidden. Inside the dock, Colin Joyce behaved less like a defendant fighting for his life, and more like a bored teenager in detention. He yawned. He stretched. He smirked at the families of his victims. He stared down the jury. He thought his reputation was his shield. He thought, I am Colin Joyce. I am the king of Moss Side. You cannot touch me. But the evidence was overwhelming. The police had pieced together a mosaic of mobile phone data, vehicle tracking, and the devastating testimony of the insiders. They painted a picture of a gang that operated with the discipline of a death squad, but the maturity of schoolyard bullies. The jury saw through the intimidation. They saw the men for what they were, not kings, not soldiers, but murderers. In April 2009, the verdicts were read. Colin Joyce, guilty. Amos, guilty. The judge, Mr. Justice Langstaff, did not mince words. He looked at Joyce and described him as a man who derived pleasure from the power of killing. He called him a narcissist. He called him the leader of a gang that had brought misery to Manchester. Joyce was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 39 years. He would be an old man before he even saw a parole board. Amos received a life sentence with a minimum of 35 years. The fallout was immediate. With the generals removed from the board, the Gooch Gang structure collapsed. The fear that had paralyzed Moss Side began to lift. The statistics tell the story better than any words could. In the years following the imprisonment of Joyce and Amos, shootings in Greater Manchester dropped by over 90%. The Gunchester tag, which had plagued the city for decades, finally began to fade. The irony is palpable. Colin Joyce and Amos wanted to be legends. They wanted to be remembered as the toughest, most feared men in Manchester. And in a way, they got their wish. They are remembered, but they are not remembered as kings. They are remembered as the men who pushed their luck too far. They are remembered for the funeral shooting, the single dumbest, most arrogant tactical error in the history of Manchester gangland warfare. They soaked the streets in blood to build a throne, only to find that a throne built on blood is slippery. And when they fell hard. Today, Moss Side is different. The scars are still there, buried under new developments and community centers. But the war is over. The generals are rotting in high-security cells, left with nothing but their memories of a time when they thought they ruled the world. They learned the hard way that in the UK underworld, there is no such thing as untouchable. Every reign ends. And usually, it ends because you made the one mistake you swore you never would. You believed your own hype. This was the Manchester Turf War. And this is how it ended.